Hey everybody, welcome to It's Not Scary, It's Just Music. It's me, SJ. Hey, welcome to another episode in our Season 2 finale series in which we're going through the entirety of the 1990s major genre group by major genre group. In today's episode, we're talking about R&B, which is very exciting. I'm very excited for us to talk about this one. Just as a reminder, if you're interested in listening to any of the other episodes in this finale series where we go through other genre groups across the decade, you can feel free to check those out as well. Additionally, if you're interested in listening to any of the music that I talk about in today's episode, you can check out the playlist that I've linked in the description of the episode here. As well, if you're interested in listening to my big playlist for the entirety of the 1990s in which I've pulled together every meaningful or important or impactful song or one that I just really liked a lot into one big giant list for all the 1990s, you should be able to check that out now that I've dropped all of the episodes for this series along with Punk, which was the last one to be dropped. So feel free to check it out. So what are we going to talk about today? First, we're going to review what we recapped in the 1980s for R&B. Next, we're going to overview the two subgenres that we're going to be discussing today for the 1990s. And then we're going to dive into each of those two subgenres with milestone songs across the decade and why we picked them. So, for the 1980s recap, when we talked about R&B, the songs that we discussed were The Jacksons' This Place Hotel, Michael Jackson's Thriller, Chaka Khan's I Feel For You, Lisa Lisa's From Head to Toe, and then finally Janet Jackson's Miss You Much, which was a phenomenal list of songs that I just gave you right there. 5 amazing songs that really did a good job recapping how amazing the evolution was in R&B over the course of the 1980s. And the basic story of R&B in the 1980s from end to end is that we went from carrying over what existed in the disco space in the 1970s, started to slow it down a little bit more, where if disco's entire existence came about because we took the golden era of Motown and just sped it up, with a little bit more of a dancey rhythm to it, and that's how disco came about. In the 1980s, we took what we learned from the dancey factors of disco and slowed it down just a little bit so that we can better appreciate the journey that the R&B singer is taking us on. But it's still got the rhythms, it's still got the blues influences, right? R&B, it's still got the sexy vibes to it because that's, for the most part, what we're talking about in R&B music. Mostly, I think every single one of those songs, This Place Hotel, it's spooky, but it's love. Thriller, spooky, but it's love. I Feel For You, it was a track originally done by Prince, and then Chaka Khan remade it, but it was also about love from head to toe. I Love You from Head to Toe. Miss You Much, also about love. So it's almost always about love, sex, or something in between. Relationships mostly. That's often the journey that we tend to go on when it comes to R&B. And the 1990s are no different, at least when it comes to straight ahead R&B. Because the two main genres that we're going to talk about today are what I call neo-solo R&B, or you're a solo artist in the R&B space, and we're doing something on the newer side. And I'm calling this neo-solo R&B just because there was old R&B way back in the way back, and this is a new era. And when we were talking about the different waves of R&B back in the 1980s, where I think we ended with Janet Jackson being the fourth wave of R&B, that's just the neo-solo R&B idea. So in 1990, we're going to pick it right back up where we left off in 1989. And then the other one we're going to discuss is trip hop, because we haven't talked about it yet, and trip hop technically has ties and roots back to the R&B space, so it's a good place for us to talk about it. So to get going, when we discussed neo-solo R&B, like I did a second ago, the first 4 waves that we experienced of neo-solo R&B took place in the 1980s, as I walked through them in the 1980s recap episode. And if you're interested in going back and listening to what I said about the evolution across that first, second, third, fourth wave, spoiler alert, most of them were ushered in by Janet Jackson. She was very aggressively pushing envelopes in the latter half of the 80s. Michael Jackson certainly brought us to the second wave with albums like Thriller, but then Janet Jackson really picked it up for us and took it into whole new directions. So when you think about neo-solo R&B, that's approximately where you conceive of it for us. And the macro that it takes us across the entirety of the 90s is that the beats become a little bit less syncopated and just become more dynamic and interesting as time goes on. I think that producers are using a lot more interesting artifacts in the background of tracks to add some power, add some intrigue, add some additional flavor to them. And then also, I'd like to believe that the production quality is also going up considerably, because as time goes on, the singer's voice gets better put front and center and just highlighted more effectively than in previous iterations. And the thing I will tell you before we really start to dig in is that we end up at the end of this in a 10th wave. So Every single track that we're going to talk about today is a different wave from the fourth, where we're picking up from Janet Jackson in 1989 all the way to 1999 across 6 waves. So just as a frame of reference, the amount of evolution, however minor it was aggressive. Because where some artist or some small contingent of artists would figure something out about pushing the envelope to getting to a new plateau with the music, there was always somebody right behind them coming up with a new idea to push the envelope even further and take us into a totally different place. The amount of evolution and aggressive experimentation and just wild creativity in the R&B space in the 90s is profound. And I'd like to believe that most people that are big fans of R&B from the 90s would 100% agree with me that there was aggressive experimentation. People were certainly adopting ideas and using them and maintaining some of these waves along the way, but there were definitely artists that were always jumping out in front to do something new, something interesting. And if it wasn't them, it was a producer that they've aligned themselves with, perhaps aligned in conjunction with an empire a la Empire Rap, but sometimes not. Sometimes they themselves were standing up their own empire. So it was just a really interesting decade for the R&B space. And I don't entirely remember what happens in the 2000s, but I'd like to believe that this rapid pace with which R&B was aggressively changing and evolving over the decade can't possibly be maintained for more than another 5-10 years before it just exhausts itself. But who can say? I don't remember. You might remember if you're a big R&B fan, but I don't remember. So I'm excited for us to go on that journey into the 2000s too, because the 90s for R&B was crazy. So let's get started. In 1990, with the fourth wave still, so we're still in the fourth wave just to help calibrate our understanding and expectation, with Johnny Gill and his album Johnny Gill, so eponymous, and the track is Rub You the Right Way. This very much sounds like the drum kits that Janet Jackson was using on Miss You Much. The beat tracks, the bass lines, the rest of the instrumentation, it all very much sounds like Miss You Much. You could probably even go back and listen to Miss You Much by Janet Jackson and then listen to this. They sound very, very close to one another. So it's a good bass line. It's still fourth wave. And Johnny Gill is absolutely killing it with this song because the innuendo is barely there, right? Like it's almost completely overt. Rub You the Right Way is the thinnest of thinly veiled innuendos. And we're not even getting going yet, but that's definitely the vibe of R&B, at least in the 90s, is the veneer of innuendo slips further and further and further until it basically doesn't exist at all. So I'm excited for us to go there. Then 2 years later, Mary J. Blige comes out with her album, What's the 411, and her wildly famous track, Real Love, which we absolutely did talk about in the 92 episode. And this is the fifth wave. And you could tell that this is different because the beats are different. So it's a little bit less just a steady beat, kind of like how Miss You Much was or Rub You the Right Way is. So Real Love is kind of out of sync a little bit. It's got a really interesting bass line to it. The bass to it is a lot heavier. Her singing does not necessarily sound like 80s anymore. Johnny Gill kind of sounds back, like if you want to go to Alexander O'Neal, it sounds a little bit more 80s. Mary J. Blige does not sound 80s at all. It sounds like she's leaning into the 90s with a very soulful voice, and she's really carrying forward what this is going to be into the 90s for sure. She's really setting the tone now. So then 2 years later, we get to the sixth wave with Brandy, who we didn't talk about, unfortunately, at all during this entire decade, on her album Brandy. And the track is another wildly famous track by her, Baby. I think this might even be her first major hit. And you can hear the connection point between Baby and Real Love. They have some connections. The beats have a similar idea behind them, but Baby has added a couple extra hi-hats to it. So it's added a couple extra drum artifacts in there that aren't just necessarily the bass beat, like that heavy bass beat of Real Love. Brandy's added a couple more things in there. The harmonies sound a little bit more fully realized, like the layering of her voice on top of one another sounds a little bit better executed in the production side than Mary J. Blige's, where you had a couple little moments in Real Love where she did some layered harmonies, but Baby really leans into those layered harmonies. So we're getting into this totally new wave, right? It's sixth wave. And you could even think in this moment, it's only been 4 years between Rub You the Right Way and Baby, and they sound totally different already, right? We've gone ahead 2 waves already, and Baby already sounds completely far away from what was happening in 1990. It's wild, right? We're getting even further away. So then 2 years later, another 2 years later, we get to the seventh wave with Aaliyah's 1 in a Million, and the track is also 1 in a Million. We definitely talked about this album in the 1996 episode, and I think then I might have called it like fifth wave or something, but As I was going through this recap experience, I realized just how many smaller waves we went through to get to this moment, and it's wild. So we've already gone 3 waves and it's only been 6 years. Can you just line up One in a Million with Rub You the Right Way for a second? Just like listen to the first 5 seconds of both. They sound nothing alike. It's crazy. One in a Million kind of sounds like Baby. It's starting to sound a lot less like Real Love at this point. One in a Million sounds even more leaning into the future. It sounds even more firmly planted in the 90s, where Real Love sounds kind of archaic by comparison. This sounds even more fully realized. Obviously, Timbaland is helping her out a lot. Not that Aaliyah is not a genius, but Timbaland is definitely influencing the direction of R&B in this moment, unsurprisingly. But One in a Million does sound like it's really leaning forward, doesn't it? Absolutely. 7th wave. One in a Million and Rub You the Right Way. Couldn't be further apart from each other. Until we go 1 year into the future, so 1997, and we're already in an 8th wave. And it's with Usher, who we also didn't talk about. Crazy. On his album My Way. And the track is You Make Me Wanna, ... It's one of his first huge hits. And you could tell in this too that similarly to Real Love, Baby, One in a Million, that the beats are becoming a little bit more dynamic. Every single time we go through one of these waves, this one is even more dynamic. It's even less syncopated, and it's got a lot more of that hi-hat drum and a little less of that deep bass drum. The bass is also pulled up considerably, and Usher is bringing in a lot more harmonies into it. Also, he's really mellow versus Johnny Gill, who is a lot more lively. Usher's bringing in that more subdued, sultry, soulful approach, which again sounds totally different. You play Rub You the Right Way and You Make Me Wanna right up against each other, and they might as well be in different zip codes at this point, right? We've gone so far in just 7 years. Like I said, the experimentation in R&B was just absolutely insane. It's amazing. And then you think that that's amazing, and then we go 1 year into the future and we're already at the 9th wave with Are You That Somebody on Are You That Somebody by Aaliyah again with the help of Timbaland. Timbaland is very much in this track. He's all over it. But this one sounds like One in a Million happened 1,000 years ago already, and it was just 2 years ago. But it was also 2 waves ago. Are You That Somebody sounds so much further ahead than You Make Me Wanna, which is so much further ahead than One in a Million, so much further than Baby. Are You That Somebody makes Baby sound like it's from 1975. It's astounding. Are You That Somebody is way out there. The beats are undeniably dynamic. How Aaliyah's using her voice, like just line that up to Mary J. Blige, where she was just singing and singing and singing and singing and just laying into those notes, laying into those harmonies. And Aaliyah is just flitting out these little notes here and there. And it's a little bit of a rap vibe in her voice. Like she's talking a little bit, she's singing a little bit, but it's not this just ongoing wave of song. Even kind of like Baby was, where it was just this rolling wave of music. Aaliyah's singing is much more up and down. It kind of comes in and comes out. It's very dynamic and fresh. It's very complex, and it's a totally different way to approach it. And again, even One in a Million 2 years prior sounded kind of like that wave of singing that was just kind of rushing in and out. And You Make Me Wanna by Usher started to pull that back a little bit, where sometimes he would be in the song and sometimes he wouldn't, and sometimes he would and sometimes he wouldn't. And then Aaliyah with Are You That Somebody, it's even more dynamic than that. So it's very, very interesting. And then finally, we get to 1999 with the 10th wave, and maybe people are going to kill me for this, or maybe not, but it's 100% true if you just leave your ego by the door. But Sisqó's Unleash the Dragon, and the track is Thong Song. Now, you might be sitting there and going, SJ, come on. Thong Song, seriously? That song is so corny. And my response to you is, well, I think it's a very ridiculous song. I also think that Sisqó is doing it in a tongue-in-cheek sort of way. Also, let's be completely honest with ourselves. Listen to Rub You the Right Way and then Thong Song. How far away are they really in terms of being overtly sexual? Seriously. I think Thong Song is actually a little bit more tasteful because Sisqó's just being completely upfront and honest about with what he's singing about. And Johnny Gill was just really leaning into the innuendo so that he could go hard into just describing all the different ways that he's going to rub you the right way, if you know what I mean, right? So let's be totally honest. Is Thong Song a little bit more overt? Yes. Are You That Somebody? Overt, sure. You Make Me Wanna? a little bit more subverted. One in a Million, little more subverted. Baby, more subverted. Real Love, more subverted. And then Rub You the Right Way is just much more innuendo. So the hidden evolution across all of these waves is that the song topic of love or relationships or sex or whatever becomes more overt. I think Sisqó is kind of a genius for the fact that he's just putting it right on the table. The literal thong is just being put on the table and saying, this is what the song is and this is what it's about. I'm not going to make any other bones about it. I'm just going to sing about this because why waste time? I just want to talk about this one specific thing. And he even does a disclaimer at the very beginning of the song in a very obviously sexy way. But he's like, look, this is what guys talk about. We could certainly, make all these innuendos and talk amongst each other and giggle about how we're going to rub our people the right way or whatever by Johnny Gill, or we could just talk about thongs. That's it. So Sisqó is a treasure for this because I'm sure at the time that it came out, people were like, hee, this is so silly and so naughty. But the reality is that, was it just very slightly more overt than the previous waves music topic-wise? Yeah, just a little bit. And because of that, it was pushing the envelope. And it became a pop hit, didn't it? Right? Because most people know what thong song is. Even people that are not R&B enthusiasts or as pasty gets, you know what thong song is. So across 6 waves, we got from Rub You the Right Way to thong song. In just 9 years, 10 years, 1990 to 1999, we went across 6 waves and we get to thong song. So the silliness of the song aside, the great things about this song are that the beat is that dynamic, again, kind of like Are You That Somebody, except it's been softened out. So it seems like it's even more intentional. It seems smoother as an approach. It's got those violins in it, which are absurd in a wonderfully beautiful way. Like I said, there's almost no innuendo. If anything, the innuendo is just completely gone at this point. And Sisqó is doing a tiny bit of rapping, but not really, sort of sexy talking, and the singing is great. The layered harmonies are great. He's just thrown everything in there. And also, to be fair, I think he's pulling in some of the best and most entertaining pieces of R. Kelly, so we don't have to talk about R. Kelly, which would be great. And he's just kind of pulling it all together into this pop hit that is scandalous enough to draw attention from every demographic, and he just totally nailed it. He absolutely nailed it. It's a funny, amazing, wonderful, head-bobbing song. Can't deny it. So it's a great way for us to end the discussion on neo-solo R&B for the 1990s. So now that we've talked about the fun journey through love and sex and relationships of neo-solo R&B, let's talk about the very deeply intense and kind of dour trip-hop. Not to say that I don't love trip hop, because trip hop is one of my favorite subgenres of all time, but compared to neo-solo R&B, it's kind of a strange bummer, but I love it nonetheless. So the first thing I'll say is we could have just as easily used Massive Attack across the entirety of the 90s to tell the entire story of trip hop, because their album Blue Lines at the very beginning of the decade was a perfectly good bass line, and we could have used Protection and No Protection, and then we could have used Mezzanine at the very end. So we could have just as easily used only Massive Attack to tell the entire trip hop story through the 4 waves that it had across the decade without breaking a sweat. But I'm giving you a little bit more of a dynamic experience just for funsies. So when we talk about trip hop, just as a baseline, because we didn't talk about that in the 1980s recap because it wasn't so much of a thing yet, is that it goes through many different evolutions, some of which are electronica based, some of which are just deeply R&B based, some of which have folk roots to them. So there's a lot going on in trip hop in which you're basically bringing jazz riffs, turntablism, drum and bass, haunting vocals, all together into this really interesting package, which is why we call it trip hop. It's a little bit trippy, but it's also hip hop. And as a result, it's got quite a wide variety of people in the artist consortium of trip hop. The community of trip hop artists is vast and wide, and it spreads out into many other different subgenres. And so what you'll find is that certain artists who don't normally land solely in trip hop will do trip hop stuff, and it just happens to land in that zone, sometimes by accident. So what do we mean by that? Well, the first track that we're going to talk about is in a proto wave of trip hop, so before it even really got started in 1990, by Sinead O'Connor of all people on her album I Do Not Want What I Haven't Got, and the track is I Am Stretched on Your Grave. So we absolutely did talk about this album and this track specifically in 1990, but I absolutely did call this out as being some kind of early version of trip hop. I think I called it avant-garde, I called it folk, but I absolutely did flag it for trip hop. So because of that, it was a little bit early to the show, but it was definitely part of the show nonetheless. You can hear in this that it sounds almost like it's certainly avant-garde, but it's going in the direction of trip hop, but by accident, purely by accident. It's got the haunting vocals, it's a little bit got that jazzy beat line to it, which are total full-blown hallmarks of trip hop, but it sounds like it's almost on accident. It doesn't sound like she's doing trip hop, like that was her goal. It sounded like she was just doing some haunting avant folk thing, and it just became what this is. But this is so very obviously and clearly trip hop, even if it's just a proto version of it. So then 1 year later in 1991, we get to Sade's Love Deluxe, and the track is Cherish the Day. I call this the first wave, but again, I don't necessarily think Sade was sitting there and going, oh yeah, I'm totally gonna make trip hop. I doubt that very much, because at that time Blue Lines came out, I think in 1991, and that was probably more better defined as trip hop. It's possible that Sade was like leaning into those areas and went in that direction, but Sade has often been known as more of a neo-soul, soul singer, jazz, R&B fusion kind of singer. So the possibility that she was doing trip hop on purpose is less than half chance, but it's still so very obviously trip hop. So whether or not she was getting influenced by others that were more clearly moving in trip hop directions, who can say? But this is very obviously trip hop. It's got the haunting vocals. It sounds a little bit more fully realized and cleaned up than I Am Stretched on Your Grave, which came out a year prior by Sinead O'Connor. It just sounds more cohesive, like there's more of a perspective behind it, and it's a little bit more on purpose, but maybe not all the way on purpose. So then 3 years later, we move into the second wave of trip hop with Portishead's Dummy, no surprise, and the track is Strangers. So I could have used almost any of the tracks on Dummy, but I went with Strangers just because it helps better paint the picture to connect back to Cherish the Day. So Strangers sounds like Cherish the Day, except again, it's got heavier beats behind it. It sounds a little bit more electronic based, both in terms of the record scratching turntablism. It sounds a little bit more electronically derived than Cherish the Day was, where Cherish the Day was like 95% jazz and then maybe 5% something else. This sounds maybe 40% jazz and then 50% electronically derived things or turntablism and then the singing. This is by now, by us being in the second wave in 94, we're very obviously in trip hop territory. Like nobody's misdefining this or mischaracterizing this as anything but trip hop. This is so very obviously trip hop. The haunting vocals are there. The beat and bass line are there. The turntablism artifact is in there. It's all very firmly planted. So then 2 years later, we get to the third wave of trip hop with the album Lamb by Lamb, and the track is Lusty. So this basically just takes what Strangers was doing 2 years prior and adds even more electronica to it. This sounds like it's basically Strangers plus drum and bass, even more so, where if Strangers was like Cherish the Day plus turntablism, Lusty is Strangers plus drum and bass. It's just taking it up a notch, taking it even further. And the vocals have been throttled back even more so, where Strangers by Portishead still had some haunting vocals thrown in there, but they were, I would say, even with the beat and the bass line and the musicality. And Sade's Cherish the Day was mostly about vocals. I Am Stretched on Your Grave was mostly about vocals. Lusty by 96 is about the beat and about the musicality and just a teeny tiny little bit about adding that haunting vocal in there. And then by 1998, we actually do use Massive Attack's Mezzanine, and the track is Inertia Creeps, and this is fourth wave. And the reason it's fourth wave, first of all, is that any semblance of vocals that have been used in trip hop up until this point have been stripped away to 3%. It's not even a woman singer anymore. It's male vocals. So it's, again, totally different direction. The beats are even more electronically derived. It sounds like it's mostly about that kind of electronica, drum and bass, jungle idea. We may very well even be creeping into indie electronica at this point. And it's just taking what Lusty did and creating a greater roundedness, a greater cohesion around it, where Lusty sounded like there was a bunch of individual pieces, like there was the drum and bass piece, there was the singing piece, and there was the musical stylings piece. And they were all three fairly distinct entities that layered on top of each other, but you could really tease out all the individual pieces and parts. It's as if Strangers was the most cohesive idea around trip hop at that point in time in 94, and then artists like Lamb in 96 were breaking it apart again to try and figure out how do we re-engineer this thing. And then by 98, it was back together again in this even more updated, more cohesive, more fully realized package that's going to lean us into indie electronica of the early 2000s. So that's the entire journey. Lean Up, Inertia Creeps, and I Am Stretched on Your Grave together, or even Inertia Creeps and Cherish the Day together, and they sound super far apart from each other, don't they? It's crazy how far apart they are. And yet, they're all part of the same trip-hop trajectory. How wonderful is that? So that's it. What did you agree with? What did you disagree with? Did you agree with the entirety of the 6-wave journey that we went on with neo-solo R&B, or even that I called it neo-solo R&B? There's probably a million different things we could call it, but that's what I call it just for categorization purposes. Did you agree with the fact that Massive Attack by itself could have told the entire trip-hop story by itself across all of its albums? If you're a trip-hop fan, that's not a contentious point to make, so you probably agree with that. What'd you disagree with? Did you disagree that I put Thong Song on there? You shouldn't. It's an amazing song, and you should listen to it 5 more times until you get over yourself. It's a fantastic song. What did I miss? I know that when we talked about R&B, we didn't go deeply into some of the other areas of R&B besides this, because I know that there's a few more areas. Like, we didn't talk about neo soul, and I get that. And frankly, the reason we didn't talk about neo soul very much is because it didn't evolve very much. Like, there might be some stuff on my big list for the 90s that I put in there, some key tracks that were really great that were neo soul. You know, like, I'm sure there's some Erykah Badu in there or something, but for the most part, it just didn't evolve enough for us to talk about it meaningfully. These were the two subgenres that just aggressively evolved over the course of the decade, so they were the biggest ones to hit. But I'm sure that I missed something, especially if you're a big 90s R&B-ophile, that I'm sure you're sitting there going, why did you pick this and not that? Or why'd you go through all these waves and you didn't even talk about this? Like, yeah, sure, of course. I'm going to miss some stuff. I don't doubt it. What'd you learn? Did you learn that we went through all these different iterations of R&B, or that if you were living in the 90s and listening to all this music that you might have or have not processed, that R&B was aggressively evolving over the course of the decade and just seemed to have no chill behind it whatsoever, that it was resting on no laurels whatsoever, and it was just pushing the whole decade? Did you know that? Did you learn it? Maybe. Did you learn something about the evolution of trip hop? I know that not everybody knows about trip hop or that it's their cup of tea, so hopefully you learned something about trip hop today. There's a lot more probably that you can go and learn about trip hop if you're interested, because it is such an interesting subgenre that grew up organically, throwing together about 5 or 6 different disparate subgenres of music into this new different thing. It's such an interesting subgenre how it managed to come about. It's very interesting. So hopefully you'll learn something about it, got interested in it, and maybe you want to learn more about it, because trip hop is, like I said, one of my favorite subgenres. So like I said, if you're interested in listening to any of the music that I talked about in today's episode, make sure that you check out our playlist for today's episode that I've linked in the description here. Make sure that you check out our big list now that it's been released, because I've released the final episode in the series. So make sure that you check out my big list for all of the 1990s. It's massive. Go enjoy it. Make sure that you join us again, because even though I've dropped the 90s big list, that doesn't mean that you've listened to all of the episodes in this finale series. So make sure you join us again. And also make sure that you join us when we start up season 3 for the 2000s. Make sure that you rate us and comment wherever you're listening to us so that other people can find us. Make sure that you find us on Instagram at Not Scary Just Music Pod, and subscribe so that you can find out when we're starting season 3, because it'll be here before you know it, I'm sure. Make sure that you tell your friends and tell everybody that you know and your family and people you don't know and people that you'd be excited to meet perhaps, because R&B is really great. I don't think anybody out there would turn their nose up at 90s R&B. It's kind of a beautiful, wonderful subgenre that I think a lot of people pretty well obsess over and love endlessly. So it's not going to be something particularly contentious, but is it something that you could connect with them on that maybe they don't know as well as they could, or maybe they love it and you're just starting to learn about it, right? Or maybe you both love it so much and it gives you an opportunity to talk about it even more, and go back and listen to Rub You the Right Way by Johnny Gill from 1990. When was the last time you heard that song? Go listen to that one. That's a great one. Or you could even quietly giggle in the corner about Thong Song. Go ahead, go do it. It's great. Or we could remember Aaliyah because she was a beautiful treasure and we should always be honoring her music. It's an opportunity for us to connect. And then on the trip hop side, Maybe you're not really as familiar with it, and maybe you'd like to be. And you could connect with other people about that and see what they think about it, because maybe they're not as readily open to trip hop as they are to 90s R&B music. So invite them to give it a chance, because it is really great. It is just a really interesting moment in music history. And as we always say, the only way that you can engage with this stuff and have those conversations and better connect with each other through the language that is music is to agree with one another that none of this stuff is scary. It's just 90s R&B music. Thanks for listening, everybody.